In the hushed pre-dawn light, Harriet Collins stepped onto her porch, rubbing the last traces of sleep from her eyes, only to freeze in stunned disbelief at the sight before her. There, at the edge of her yard, was a massive bear, painfully thin, with two trembling cubs by her side. The mother bear's fur looked patchy, her ribs nearly visible beneath the ragged coat, and her cubs were mewling in soft, desperate cries. Harriet's heart leaped into her throat. Instead of aggression, she sensed a plea in the bear's gaze, a silent request for help. And in that single moment, everything changed. High on the outskirts of a small Montana town named Emmeline's Peak, Harriet Collins had built a modest life among towering pines and the gentle hush of wind-blown meadows. She owned a tiny cabin constructed by her late father, perched just 3 miles from the boundaries of Glacier National Park. The cool air that drifted off distant snow-capped peaks provided relief on summer nights. Songbirds flitted in the aspens, and from time to time a passing family of deer would graze on tender shoots near the wild rose bushes that Harriet's mother once planted. Growing up, Harriet had always felt more kinship with open skies and rustling forests than with crowded city sidewalks. Solitude was her comfort, a salve to a deeper wound inflicted years ago by personal grief and heartbreak. She had once been an aspiring painter in Seattle, with dreams of gallery openings and accolades. However, after losing her father and ending a tumultuous relationship, Harriet craved peace and renewal in a place that whispered of healing. She never considered herself a stranger to the region's wildlife. Over the years, she had encountered everything from mischievous raccoons rummaging through her garbage to the elegant elk that occasionally wandered across the property at dawn. But she had never expected to be greeted by a mother bear in dire need, nor had she dreamed she would be tested in a way that would shape her very idea of compassion and resilience. That morning, a soft tendril of fear snaked through Harriet's body as she stood barefoot in the damp grass, her flannel pajamas brushing her ankles. She wasn't a reckless person, and caution around wild animals had been drilled into her from childhood. Yet, the sight of the emaciated bear, ribs showing through a dull, patchy coat, resonated with Harriet more forcefully than any moment of caution could quell. The mother bear's watery eyes reflected exhaustion and a peculiar awareness, an unspoken realization that Harriet was neither predator nor prey. Rather, the homeowner was a possible ally. The two cubs, hardly more than fluffy bundles of fur, pawed at their mother, whining with a hunger they could not articulate in words. Cautiously, Harriet backed onto the porch and slipped through the door, never taking her eyes off the bear family. Her heart pounded as she rummaged through her kitchen. What does one feed a starving bear? Every wildlife pamphlet she had ever read emphasized the importance of not feeding the animals, of maintaining their natural fear of humans. But this situation felt extraordinary. Her instincts screamed that if she didn't help, the mother and cubs might not last another day. She grabbed a loaf of whole grain bread, a bag of peanuts, and whatever leftover salmon fillets she had in her fridge from the previous night's dinner. She clutched them close, heart fluttering, and stepped out onto the porch again, taking small steps forward. The mother bear lifted her muzzle, nostrils quivering as she caught the scent of food. The cubs wobbled closer, their curiosity dancing with uncertainty. Harriet, trembling with a curious mix of fear and empathy, scattered some peanuts and placed the salmon on a large, flat rock a good distance from the house, hoping to keep a respectful boundary. It was nerve-wracking. She didn't trust the mother entirely. No one should yet. The mother bear didn't charge or roar. Instead, there was a quiet acceptance, almost relief, in the way the bear plodded forward and nudged the morsels to her cubs, letting them eat first. Harriet felt tears prick the corners of her eyes. She'd lived alone in that cabin for so long, guarded her fragile heart for so many years. And here was a bond so simple yet profound, a creature trusting her enough to share a meal in the open clearing under a sky that was just beginning to pale with dawn. For the next hour, Harriet stood a few yards away, scarcely breathing, witnessing a scene she would later recall as one of the most life-altering encounters of her existence. Once the cubs had devoured their share, the mother bear swallowed the remaining scraps, never taking her gaze from Harriet. With the meal finished, the small family huddled near the base of an ancient pine, uncertain whether to leave or stay, and Harriet wondered if they had any safe place to go at all. Finally, the mother bear emitted a low, almost inaudible growl, and the cubs followed her toward a cluster of blackberry bushes that surrounded the northern edge of the property. The mother bear threw one last glance at Harriet, not quite fear or gratitude, but a silent acknowledgement of a boundary crossed and a vulnerability shared. Then the family slipped away into the deeper woods, leaving Harriet's yard in the soft hush of morning light. Over the next few days, Harriet discovered more signs of the bear mother's presence. Deep paw prints in the moist ground, small disturbances in her compost bin, and occasionally the soft crackling of twigs just beyond the tree line. She realized the mother bear was staying close by. A local ranger, whom Harriet knew slightly, had once explained that if a bear was malnourished, it might linger in areas where it found even a small supply of food. Harriet was torn. Part of her wanted to encourage the mother bear to move on into the deeper wild, where other food sources might exist. But the more she thought about the mother bear and the helpless cubs, the more she felt a compulsion to watch over them somehow. Memories of her own late mother drifted into Harriet's thoughts. Her mother had passed away when Harriet was only 12, leaving Harriet's father to raise her alone. Those years were marked by deep sorrow and a sense that Harriet had lost a guiding force in her life far too soon. Over time, Harriet had grown familiar with that pang of emptiness that comes from missing a nurturing presence. Now, the sight of the thin bear and those vulnerable cubs triggered an ache in Harriet's chest that felt both familiar and strangely comforting. She decided, albeit with much hesitation, to do a bit more. Each morning she left out small portions of fruits, vegetables, or fish scraps at the edge of her yard, nothing too extravagant, just enough to help tide the mother bear and her cubs over. Harriet told herself it was temporary, but day by day she felt a deeper sense of connection with the mother bear. She even started whispering a name under her breath, Maple, in honor of the tall maple tree that stood at the corner of her property and under which she'd first seen the bear. The cubs, two fuzzy creatures with wide, curious eyes, provided Harriet with a sense of wonder. She had learned from local wildlife magazines that mother bears usually named their cubs in some unspoken, primal way, perhaps with growls or scents, but Harriet felt an inexplicable urge to address them too. One she called Cinder because of the darker, ash-colored fur on the cub's left flank, and the other Blossom for the patch of lighter fur, shaped somewhat like a flower on the cub's chest. She said these names only in her own thoughts, worried that speaking them aloud would further blur the boundary between caution and closeness. Harriet's personal routine changed. Where she once woke at sunrise to do a bit of yoga and drink tea in silence, she now found herself peering through her curtains to check if Maple and the cubs were prowling near the yard. She would carefully set out a small meal at the perimeter. Yet each time she did so, Harriet remembered the advice hammered into her by park rangers, locals, and the cautionary signs posted everywhere in the region: do not feed wildlife. Their survival depends on their natural wariness of humans. Feeding them breaks that barrier and often leads to conflict. The phrase, "a fed bear is a dead bear," echoed in her mind. She knew that when animals became too reliant on human generosity, it often ended in tragedy: bears euthanized, cubs orphaned, or property owners harmed. But Harriet could not shake the sight of Maple's skeletal form and those cubs desperate squeals. What was the correct choice? Let nature take its course or intervene and risk dire consequences? Her internal turmoil dredged up old memories. Years ago, Harriet had felt a similar sense of helplessness when her father was diagnosed with a rare, aggressive cancer. She had tried everything: fundraisers, clinical trials, second opinions at big city hospitals. Despite her best efforts, her father's health declined. Harriet had found herself straining to maintain composure, watching the man she loved more than anyone in the world fade away. Perhaps she was replaying that dynamic here, faced with a dire situation she couldn't stand idly by. For her, doing nothing felt like a betrayal. Her father's old friend, Carl Thompson, a retired park ranger, lived about a mile down the road. Carl was in his 70s, sharp-witted, and had spent decades studying and protecting bears in Montana's wilderness. During Harriet's childhood, Carl would regale her with stories of the region's grizzlies, black bears, and the delicate balance that kept them alive. Harriet decided, despite her fear of judgment, to visit Carl and seek advice. She pulled her aging Chevy Silverado out of the gravel driveway, the engine sputtering slightly, and made the short drive through winding roads flanked by towering pines. Carl's home was a simple cabin with a sprawling porch. He was sitting there in a worn rocking chair, reading a dog-eared copy of a Sand County Almanac by Aldo Leopold. "Harriet," he greeted, raising an eyebrow. "Haven't seen you in a while. Everything okay?" She sank into the wooden porch swing, hugging her elbows. "Not quite sure, Carl. There's a bear, a mother bear, and her 2 cubs. They're malnourished, practically starving, I think. I've been feeding them a little. Just scraps." She trailed off, waiting for the reproach. Carl's bushy eyebrows knitted together, and he set the book aside. "You know that's dangerous. For them as well as for you. Bears are unpredictable, especially with cubs." She nodded, voice trembling. "I know, but you should see her. Maple well. I call her Maple. She looks on the brink of death. I can't just sit back and do nothing." Carl exhaled, fiddling with the frayed edge of his shirt. "I've seen it before, Harriet. Sometimes a mother can't catch enough food, or maybe she's injured. Sometimes diseases or forest fires deplete their usual food sources. It's part of the natural order." He paused, as though measuring his words carefully. "But I also know you. You've got a heart bigger than most. Let's figure this out, so no one ends up hurt." He asked her a litany of questions. Did the mother bear show signs of injury or disease? Were the cubs active and alert? What time of day did they visit? Harriet answered to the best of her ability. Carl's face was troubled. Finally, he suggested calling a local wildlife rescue or letting the park service know. Harriet swallowed hard, remembering how often wildlife agencies had to relocate or euthanize nuisance bears. "But Maple's not a nuisance," Harriet pleaded. "She's just starving." Carl nodded slowly. "Let me make a few phone calls. Maybe there's a better solution than relocation. But Harriet, you have to be prepared. This might not end the way you hope." Harriet returned home, torn between wanting to abide by Carl's advice and her overwhelming empathy for Maple. The mother, bear, and cubs came again that afternoon, lingering at the clearing. Harriet stepped onto her porch, carrying just a small handful of berries and a piece of salmon skin. She placed them a respectful distance away. Maple eyed Harriet, then ambled closer, sniffing the air. The cubs followed suit, staying within a few feet of their mother. After that meager meal, Maple did something that took Harriet's breath away. The bear slowly laid down on her belly, her front paws extended, watching Harriet with tired, heavy eyes. The cubs trotted around Maple, nipping and playing, but Maple herself seemed too exhausted to do more than raise her head if one cub wandered too far. Harriet found herself moving closer, speaking softly, though she wasn't sure if Maple understood a word. "You're going to be okay, I promise. There are people who can help. Whether it was a foolhardy promise, Harriet didn't know. But for the moment, the words hung between them, filled with the warmth of Harriet's desire to save this little family. The late afternoon sun poured gold across the clearing, illuminating Maple's fur. A hush lingered in the air as Harriet examined Maple's condition. She noticed a scar across Maple's flank, likely from a past encounter with a larger predator or from rummaging near something sharp. Her fur was thinning in patches, especially near her hips, and her movements seemed slow, like each step required effort. Harriet's mind leaped to the possibility that Maple had an underlying infection or a digestive issue, preventing her from gaining weight. Or maybe it was simpler. The region's food supply had been poor that year due to drought. Harriet had read about how berry bushes had been decimated during a hot summer, leaving many animals struggling to find enough calories before winter's onset. As evening fell, Maple and her cubs slipped away again into the murky shadows of the pines. Harriet retreated indoors, heart heavy. She made a pot of herbal tea, but her hands shook as she lifted the cup to her lips. She was no veterinarian. She barely had enough money to keep up with her own bills. How could she possibly care for a wild bear and her cubs? The flicker of her lantern cast dancing shapes on the walls, mocking her worry. She made up her mind to wait for Carl's word. If he found an expert who could help, Harriet would comply. But she prayed that Maple's life wouldn't be forcibly uprooted, or worse, ended to avoid potential problems. That night, Harriet dreamed of her father again. She was a child, fishing with him by the banks of a crystalline river in Glacier National Park. It was midsummer, the sky a vibrant blue, and a gentle breeze stirred the long grass. Harriet felt the warm sun on her face, smelled the fresh pine in the air. Her father was smiling, telling her that all creatures are connected, from the tiniest insect to the largest grizzly. He was about to say something else, something important, but a shrill cry shattered the tranquility. Harriet spun around to see Maple struggling against a roaring forest fire, her cubs trapped in swirling smoke, crying out for help. Harriet wanted to run to them, but her feet were rooted to the ground. When she finally tore herself free, her father was gone, replaced by flickering flames that devoured the landscape. She woke drenched in sweat, heart hammering. Mornings in Harriet's cabin often began in solitude, but that day she felt the weight of her dream linger. She forced down a slice of toast. Stomach churning with anxiety, she checked her phone for any missed calls from Carl. Nothing. She decided to distract herself by tending to the chores she'd put off, mowing the small patch of grass near the porch, fixing the squeaky hinge on the back door, organizing her father's old tools in the shed. Yet every slight noise in the forest drew her gaze, hoping it was Maple returning. Terrified it might be a sign that something bad had happened. Finally, around noon, her phone buzzed with Carl's name. She answered in a heartbeat. "Harriet," Carl said, "I spoke with a friend who runs a wildlife rehabilitation center near Kootenai Falls. They might be able to help, but we'd need to get Maple and her cubs to them. Problem is, capturing them can be risky." Harriet's heart sank. "Do we have another option?" she asked. "One that doesn't involve sedation or moving them from their home territory." Carl hesitated. "We could try supplement feeding under supervision, but Harriet, it's a slippery slope. The authorities might disapprove. Bears that grow accustomed to human feeding often end up euthanized later when they lose fear of people and rummage through towns. I don't want that on my conscience." "Neither do you," Harriet sighed. "No, of course not. I can't let her die. If she is truly starving, sedation might kill her anyway, right?" She thought of Maple's frail body. What if the tranquilizers were too strong? What if the trauma separated Maple from her cubs at a critical moment? Carl's tone was gentle. "Let me gather more info. Maybe there's a compromise. In the meantime, Harriet, be cautious. Keep your distance. Don't let Maple associate your cabin as a food source. It's for your safety and hers." After the call ended, Harriet leaned her forehead against the cabin's doorframe, an ache in her chest. She recalled every instance in her life where she'd had to make a decision with no perfect outcome, from leaving Seattle's art scene to caring for her dying father. Each choice had carried a cost. She worried this might be another heartbreak waiting to happen. Late that afternoon, Harriet heard a soft rustling near the blackberry bushes. She peered out the window. Maple was there, the cubs tugging at the branches, tongues lapping at whatever few berries remained. Harriet watched for a few moments, noticing how Maple's limbs seemed weaker, her posture listing to one side. The mother bear took a tentative step and then sank onto her haunches, panting as if she'd just run a marathon. A surge of urgency propelled Harriet outside. She didn't approach Maple directly, but made her presence known, calling softly, "Hey, Maple, I'm here." The cubs scampered closer to their mother, anxiously. Harriet set down a small pan of water, along with a modest portion of plain rice she'd cooked and cooled. She had read somewhere that plain rice could be gentle on an animal's stomach. Maple smelled the rice, paused, and carefully began eating. Harriet retreated to the porch, heart beating hard. For several long minutes, Harriet observed Maple finish the small meal, panting all the while. The sun dipped toward the horizon, bathing the clearing in a golden glow. The cubs appeared restless. Blossom hopped onto Maple's back, prodding her with tiny paws, while Cinder circled around, sniffing at Harriet from a safe distance. Harriet felt that inexplicable pang in her chest again, a mix of awe and heartbreak. How can such a majestic creature be brought so low? She wondered. When Maple finally stood, she staggered slightly, then trudged toward Harriet, the homeowner's breath caught in her throat. She glanced at the cabin door just a few feet behind her, calculating if she could bolt inside if Maple got too close. But Maple stopped a few yards away, lifting her muzzle as though testing Harriet's scent. Harriet glanced down at her own hands, which trembled from a cocktail of adrenaline and empathy. She didn't move closer. Slowly, Maple lowered her head in what seemed almost like resignation or acceptance. A swirling hush of wind whipped around them, carrying the scent of pine and earth. In that moment, Harriet felt tears slide down her cheeks. It was as if Maple was silently telling her, "I have nothing left to lose. Help me if you can." With one last look, Maple turned and ambled into the forest, cubs bounding after her. Harriet stared at the tree line long after they disappeared. She knew now that she was part of Maple's fragile fight for survival. There could be no turning back. In the following days, Harriet continued her delicate balancing act, leaving minimal food and water near the property's edge while doing her best not to embolden Maple or the cubs into fully trusting humans. Occasionally, Harriet would spot Maple resting under the shade of the maple tree, her body laboring for breath. The cubs, playful in their innocence, batted at fallen leaves or chased each other in dizzying circles. Harriet's routine shifted around them. Her painting projects in the cabin's loft were put on hold. The daily phone calls with Carl grew more frequent, and her nights were punctuated by dreams and nightmares about the bears. One afternoon, Harriet ventured into the local grocery store, named McAllister's Market, about 10 miles away. She needed supplies for herself, but she also picked up extra fruits, some unsalted nuts, and even a small container of honey. She felt a pinch of guilt at the checkout counter, imagining that she was crossing a line by buying food, specifically for wild creatures. The cashier, Sandra, who had known Harriet for years, gave her a polite smile. "Expecting guests?" she asked. Harriet mustered a half-truth, something like that. Loading her groceries into the Chevy Silverado, Harriet noticed a small flyer taped to a lamppost, "Bear Alert. Recent sightings in local yards. Do not feed. Contact wildlife officials if you see a bear in distress." Harriet looked around, feeling uneasy. She realized the entire community was aware of the struggling bear population that year. Drought had shriveled the berry supply, and fish were less abundant in local streams. Her chest tightened. She dreaded the possibility that Maple could wander into another yard in an equally desperate search for food. Would that neighbor show compassion or simply call the authorities? That worry became real the following morning when Harriet woke to the sound of an unfamiliar car engine idling in her driveway. She peered through her window and saw a maroon SUV with the logo of the county's wildlife department. Her stomach lurched. Carl, she thought. Did he send them here? She quickly pulled on a sweater and stepped outside, carefully shutting the door behind her. A tall woman with a stern face stood next to the SUV, scanning the clearing. "Miss Collins?" the woman asked in a clipped tone. Harriet nodded. "I'm Beth Langley from the county's Fish and Wildlife Service. We got reports of a malnourished bear roaming this area. We wanted to check in, see if you've spotted anything unusual." Harriet feigned mild curiosity. "A bear? I see them from time to time. We're close to the forest after all." Beth nodded, though her gaze was sharp. "Yes, but this one is described as quite thin, accompanied by 2 cubs. There's concern it might be injured or unable to forage properly." Harriet forced a calm expression. "I'll keep my eyes open. I haven't noticed anything alarming." Inside, her heart pounded. She felt a twinge of guilt and panic. If Beth discovered Harriet was feeding Maple, the outcome could be dire, possibly sedation, relocation, or euthanasia if Maple was considered a public risk. Beth handed Harriet a card. "If you see them, give me a call immediately. The department will assess the situation and take necessary steps. We can't have a starving bear getting too comfortable around people." Harriet nodded again, managing a polite smile. Once Beth drove away, Harriet felt a cold sweat break across her skin. She gazed at the forest line, dread seeping into her bones. I can't let them take Maple, not when she's so close to recovery. But was she close to recovery, or was Harriet simply clinging to hope? Despite her fear, Harriet noticed subtle improvements in Maple over the next week. The mother bear's eyes appeared brighter. She stood more steadily, and while still thin, she seemed less lethargic. The cubs grew bolder, wandering a bit farther from Maple to poke their noses in the undergrowth. Harriet found their antics adorable, if bittersweet. She spent her evenings in a rocking chair on the porch, watching them from a safe distance, awed by the gentle determination pulsing through Maple's every action to protect her cubs. One late afternoon, Harriet ventured into the forest on a cautious walk, carrying a small camera. She had an urge to document Maple and her cubs, both for her own records and perhaps as a way to remember them should they leave soon. The forest was draped in dappled sunlight, pine needles crunching softly underfoot. She passed clusters of wild roses, their petals dropping as summer began its slow fade into early autumn. She found Maple near a shallow stream, gazing into the water. The cubs were playing with drifting leaves, swatting them with clumsy paws. Harriet took a few cautious photos from behind a cluster of bushes, the zoom lens capturing Maple's soulful eyes. In that snapshot, Maple's gaze seemed to carry the weight of an entire wilderness, timeless, resolute, but heavy with unspoken burdens. Harriet wondered if Maple recognized her even at this distance. Was there some sense of familiarity, or did she simply see Harriet as the bearer of occasional meals? A fleeting resource in a hostile world. Harriet's heart ached. She felt both humility and an odd gratitude that she was privileged to witness such raw beauty. On her walk back, Harriet spotted fresh deer tracks and the remains of a berry-laden bush that had been thoroughly scavenged. She realized that Maple was doing her best to find natural sources of food, not entirely reliant on Harriet's offerings. This filled her with a spark of hope. Perhaps, with time, Maple would gain enough strength to prepare for the long winter or move on to richer feeding grounds deeper in the park. That night, Harriet attempted to resume her painting in the loft. She had a canvas that had been half finished for months, a sweeping landscape of Montana's mountains at dusk. She dipped her brush into violet paint, recalling the hue of the mountains at twilight. Her strokes were hesitant at first, but then she began adding subtle hints of movement in the tree line, a suggestion of wildlife hidden in the shadows. She discovered she was painting a faint silhouette of a bear. As the shape took form, tears blurred her vision. Maple had become more than just an animal in Harriet's yard. She was a symbol of resilience, of a life overshadowed by hardship, yet propelled by instinct to keep going for the sake of her young. And Harriet felt that same quality within herself. She had survived heartbreak, loss, and years of seclusion. Now she was discovering a capacity for unconditional care that both frightened and emboldened her. In the quiet hush of her loft, Harriet reflected on the last days of her father's life. She remembered the final moments by his bedside, the gentle pressure of his hand in hers, and the steady beep of hospital machinery. He had asked her to be brave, to keep looking for beauty in the world, to find love and give it generously. At the time, Harriet had felt that was a tall order for a broken heart. But now, with Maple's plight unfolding in her own backyard, Harriet realized she was honoring her father's request in the most unexpected way. She closed her eyes and whispered, "I'm trying, Dad. I'm trying." The words filled the empty loft, a solemn promise drifting on the faint smell of turpentine. 2 days later, the calm was shattered. Harriet woke to a commotion outside, the high-pitched shrieks of the cubs and the frenzied barking of a neighbor's dog. She sprang out of bed, grabbing a flashlight as she raced outside into the grey morning light. Her neighbor to the west, a gruff man named Bill Hawthorne, owned a large German shepherd that was notoriously territorial. Harriet's heart lurched. What if Bill tried to shoot Maple? She followed the source of the commotion around the side of her cabin and into the clearing near the maple tree. There, the German shepherd was barking viciously, circling Maple and her cubs. Maple was up on her hind legs, teeth bared, letting out terrifying roars to deter the dog. The cubs cowered behind their mother, squealing. Harriet's pulse hammered in her ears. She shouted, "Hey, stop!" Without thinking, she grabbed a metal bucket from the porch and banged it loudly, hoping to distract the dog. The sudden clamor caused the German shepherd to pause, looking toward Harriet. Maple took the opportunity to lash out with a warning swipe, missing the dog by inches but sending a clear signal. The dog barked once more, then retreated, hackles still raised, as Bill thundered onto the scene, rifle in hand. "What in tarnation's going on here?" Bill demanded. Harriet put herself between Bill and Maple, heart in her throat. "Your dog was harassing the bear. Please, just take him back." Bill scowled. "Bears don't belong this close to our homes. I see that scrawny thing messing around here again. I'll take care of it." Harriet's eyes flashed with anger. "She's hungry, Bill. Show some compassion." The tension was thick. Maple growled, her eyes flicking between Harriet and Bill, uncertain who posed the greater threat. The dog continued barking, but Bill finally grabbed the leash. "You've been feeding it, haven't you?" He snarled at Harriet. "Word around town is you've been breaking the rules. Now look what's happening. We're all in danger because of your bleeding heart." Harriet's cheeks burned with indignation. But before she could respond, Maple let out another defensive roar, ushering the cubs behind her as she inched toward the tree line. Harriet turned and stepped out of Maple's path, praying Maple wouldn't attack. Bill leveled his rifle but didn't fire. Harriet locked eyes with him. "Don't," she pleaded, her voice trembling with urgency. Bill finally lowered the weapon as Maple and the cubs loped off into the forest, adrenaline radiating from every tense muscle in the mother bear's body. Harriet let out a quivering breath, relief washing over her. Bill glared at her, dog leash clutched in a white-knuckled grip. "I'm warning you, keep that beast away, or I will handle it." Then he stormed off, dragging his still barking dog behind him. Harriet felt her knees threaten to buckle. She pressed her palms against them, gulping for air. The line had been crossed. Maple and the cubs were in immediate danger. Harriet realized then the precariousness of her situation. If Maple lingered around Harriet's cabin, Bill or someone like him might take matters into their own hands. And it would be my fault, Harriet thought. I'm the one who fed her. Following the confrontation, Harriet dialed Carl's number with trembling fingers, explaining the incident in broken fragments. Carl listened calmly. "Harriet, that's the exact scenario we were worried about. If Maple keeps returning, someone else might shoot her. She's too weak to roam further for food right now, but staying here puts her at risk." Harriet swallowed the lump in her throat, tears threatening. There must be another way. She's showing signs of improvement. If we just had a little more time, Carl sighed. "I've spoken to the folks at the rehabilitation center. They're willing to try a live capture and bring Maple and her cubs in for medical evaluation and care. They have a large forested enclosure where Maple can regain her strength with minimal human interaction before being released deeper in the wilderness. It's risky, but it might be the best option now that your neighbor is gunning for her." Tears slipped down Harriet's face. Relocation would mean separating Maple from the environment she knew. It also meant sedation, which could be dangerous. But was there truly any other path? "All right," Harriet whispered. "Do it. Let's try to save her. I'll help however I can." Carl promised to coordinate with the rescue team. "Harriet, prepare yourself. We might not succeed, but we'll do our best." That night, Harriet couldn't sleep. She kept replaying Maple's frantic roar, the terror in the cub's eyes, and Bill's rifle glinting in the morning sun. She walked to her father's old desk, rummaging through drawers until she found an antique photograph of her father kneeling beside a statue of a grizzly bear at Glacier National Park. He was smiling, proud to be in this land of wild wonders. Harriet clutched the photo to her chest. "I'll do everything I can," she told the memory of her father, tears glistening. "I won't let them die if I can help it." By dawn, a small team from the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center arrived with Carl. They brought humane traps, a couple of large metal cages that could be baited with fish and sweet-smelling fruit. The plan was to set the traps near the forest's edge, far enough from Harriet's cabin to avoid suspicion from neighbors, but close to where Maple had been seen. Once Maple was captured, the crew would tranquilize her gently, check her vitals, and then, if safe, do the same for the cubs to transport them together. Harriet led them to a shaded spot behind a cluster of pines. Her stomach was in knots. She understood the necessity of capturing Maple, but she hated the idea of Maple waking up in a cage, even briefly. Carl placed a reassuring hand on Harriet's shoulder. "It's the kindest option we have right now." They spent the morning setting up the traps, covering them with camouflage tarps and sprinkling fish oil around the entrance. The team retreated to a respectful distance, leaving a trail camera to monitor any movement. Harriet lingered near the trap, whispering a silent prayer. "Come on, Maple, let us help you." All day and into the evening, they waited. Maple and the cubs did not appear. Harriet paced her porch, glancing at the spot where Bill's dog had nearly attacked Maple. She worried they had been scared off permanently, or worse, that Maple had collapsed somewhere deeper in the woods. By nightfall, Harriet felt physically and emotionally drained. In the early hours of the next morning, Harriet was startled awake by a loud, metallic clang echoing through the still air. She jolted upright, heart thudding. The trap! She threw on a jacket and raced outside. The rescue team was already heading toward the cages. Carl handed Harriet a flashlight, cautioning her to stay behind him. As they approached, the beam of the flashlight revealed Maple inside one of the cages. Pacing with alarm, the cubs were not inside. Maple was letting out frantic huffs and low moans, her claws scraping the metal bars. Harriet's chest tightened at the sight. Maple's fur stood on end, fear emanating from every tense muscle. One of the rescue workers, a veterinarian named Dr. Garza, carefully approached with a tranquilizer dart. "We need to keep her calm so she doesn't injure herself," Dr. Garza explained. Harriet bit her lip, tears threatening, as she watched Maple throw her weight against the cage walls. Suddenly, the undergrowth near them rustled. The two cubs emerged, squeaking and pawing at the cage, desperate to reach their mother. Harriet's heart wrenched. The cubs' cries were heart-piercing, and Maple responded with muffled roars, pacing faster. Dr. Garza signaled for one of the other team members to gently place a smaller cage with open doors near the cubs, hoping they would enter on their own to be close to their mother. But the cubs were terrified, uncertain how to navigate this strange metal box. Maple's agitation grew. Harriet could see the mother bear's eyes flicking between the cubs and the humans. Carl tried to soothe the scene, speaking in a low voice. "Easy, Maple, it's okay." But Maple roared again, thrashing and bucking. Dr. Garza lifted the tranquilizer rifle. Harriet turned away, the mere thought of Maple's fear choking her. In the hush of that pre-dawn moment, Harriet whispered, "Please let her be okay." A soft peft cut through the air. The dart embedded in Maple's flank. The mother bear snarled, then staggered. Within minutes, Maple grew sluggish, eventually collapsing into a deep sedation. The cubs began to cry louder, pawing at the bars. Harriet rushed to the smaller cage, tears streaming as she tried to coax them in. She offered a handful of berries, voice trembling with compassion. "It's okay, come on, your mum's just sleeping." One of the cubs took hesitant steps forward. The other followed. Desperate to stay near Maple, they finally inched inside the cage to get closer to the source of her scent. When Dr. Garza and the team confirmed Maple was fully sedated, they opened the larger cage, carefully strapped Maple onto a bear stretcher, and placed her in the back of the transport truck. The cubs, each sedated in turn, but with a much smaller dose, were gently carried over as well. Harriet stood off to the side, hugging her arms to keep from shaking uncontrollably. Carl approached her, eyes soft. "We'll take them to the facility now. Dr. Garza will do a thorough medical evaluation. If Maple's condition is stable, we'll give her a chance to recover in a large, enclosed area. The cubs will stay with her. Hopefully, in a few weeks or months, they can all be reintroduced deeper into the wilderness, away from Bill or any other threat." Harriet nodded, though her heart felt like it was being torn in two. She placed a trembling hand on Maple's sedated flank for just a moment, feeling the coarse fur under her fingertips. "Be safe," she whispered. In the aftermath, Harriet's yard seemed eerily quiet. Days turned into weeks with no sign of Maple or the cubs, and Harriet found herself pacing the windows, expecting their soft forms to emerge from the tree line. She carried a hollow ache, akin to losing dear friends. She filled her days by painting again, capturing the scene of Maple's rescue in sprawling strokes, the tension of dawn light illuminating metal cages, heartbreak etched in a mother bear's eyes. Carl updated her periodically. Maple's weight was dangerously low, and she had several infections. But with antibiotics and a reliable diet, the vet expected her to recover. The cubs were in better shape, though they'd become unusually protective of Maple, whining anxiously whenever she was temporarily separated for exams. The plan was to keep them in a controlled, forested enclosure for a few months. If Maple regained enough strength before hibernation season, they would be released into the remote regions of Glacier National Park, far from human settlements. The glimpses Carl gave Harriet small stories of Maple rallying, the cubs tumbling around in shallow water, lifted her spirits. Yet Harriet also felt a strange emptiness in her chest. She realized Maple had awakened more than just compassion. Harriet had forged a sense of purpose. For so long, Harriet had lived in her cabin, guarded against forming close bonds. But in her commitment to saving Maple, Harriet had opened her heart again to risk, to empathy, to the raw vulnerability of caring for another being. Perhaps Maple had needed Harriet's help to survive, but Harriet acknowledged with a gentle, ironic smile that she had needed Maple to truly live again. Time slid into late autumn, the aspens turned golden, and the nights grew crisp. One evening, as Harriet was sweeping her porch, an unfamiliar vehicle pulled into her driveway. Out stepped Dr. Garza and Carl, both smiling. Harriet's heart fluttered at their arrival, uncertain if it was good news or bad. Dr. Garza spoke first. "We're planning to release Maple and her cubs tomorrow morning. She's put on weight, her infections have cleared, and the cubs are healthy. There's a secluded area near Avalanche Lake in Glacier National Park where they'll have ample food sources and minimal human contact." Harriet gasped, happiness blooming in her chest. "That's wonderful," Carl nodded. "We wanted to see if you'd like to join us. It's not typical for the public to be involved, but we know how important this is to you and Maple." Harriet's eyes brimmed with tears. "Yes, of course. Thank you." Early the next day, Harriet followed the transport truck into the park, winding along roads embraced by towering peaks crowned with fresh snow. Carl, Dr. Garza, and a small crew of wildlife specialists led the way down a narrow dirt path that eventually ended in a vast meadow ringed by pine forest. The sky was crisp blue, and the air tasted of winter's approach. They set the cages under the shadow of a towering cedar. Harriet stood back, heart pounding with anticipation. When the doors were finally opened, Maple ambled out. Cautious at first, she looked far better than Harriet. Remembered her coat was fuller, her gait stronger. Behind her, Cinder and Blossom emerged, gawking at the new world with wide eyes. Maple looked around, nostrils flaring, as though assessing her surroundings. Harriet stood about 20 yards away, tears glazing her vision. When Maple glanced back at the small group of humans, Harriet felt their eyes meet. She dared to believe Maple recognized her. Harriet pressed her hand to her chest in a silent greeting, tears slipping onto her jacket. Then, with a low grunt, Maple nudged her cubs forward, leading them deeper into the meadow. The cubs frolicked, chasing each other, nibbling at grass, while Maple walked steadily, occasionally glancing back, ensuring her cubs followed. A hush fell among the humans, the only sound a light breeze through the pines. Harriet's heart felt like it was being both broken and mended all at once. Eventually, Maple and her cubs slipped into the cover of the forest. Harriet stood, chest tight, tears and a smile battling for control of her face. Dr. Garza rested a hand on Harriet's shoulder. "Thank you," Harriet whispered, voice trembling. Carl nodded, eyes glistening. "They'll have a chance now." A real chance. Harriet gazed at the spot where Maple vanished. She recalled that first morning in her yard, Maple's thin frame, the cubs' desperate cries. Now, they were free and healthy, beginning a new chapter in the wild. And Harriet had found her own healing in the process. Thank you for joining me on this journey of compassion, courage, and extraordinary connection between Harriet and Maple the bear. This story reminds us that nature's struggles often reflect our own battles, and that through empathy and resilience, we can help each other find hope. If this tale moved you, please consider giving this video a thumbs up. Share it with friends and family who appreciate stories of wildlife triumph and personal growth. And most importantly, subscribe to this channel so you never miss another soul-stirring narrative. By supporting these videos, you help spread messages of preservation and compassion for all living beings. Each view, comment, and share creates a ripple, inspiring others to honor the delicate balance between humanity and nature. Let's continue exploring stories that illuminate our innate power to care for the world and for each other. Thank you again, and take care.